The do now. Looking at this set of axes, I need to plot these 2 points. E, which is at 1, 2. Notice that my scale is 1 box is 1 unit, so I will go over 1 in the x direction and up 2 in the y direction. That's my point E. I also need to plot point F, which is over 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the x direction and up 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That is F. And then I need to locate the midpoint of this line. Well, notice or recall that the definition of midpoint is that it cuts a segment into 2 equal lengths. I'm going to look at this line and see if I can identify the point which does this. Well, notice that this point here, which I'll call M for midpoint, leaves me with 2 diagonal lengths to the left and 2 diagonal lengths to the right, so it must be in the center of this line. Looking at the coordinates of point M, it seems to be at 3 in the x direction and 1, 2, 3, 4 in the y direction. Take a minute to look at the coordinates for E, 1, 2, and the coordinates for F, 5, 6, and see if you can notice any relationship between these 2 values. Well, notice that M occurs in the middle between 2 and 6. The y coordinate of point M is 4, which is exactly in the middle between 2 and 6. And the y coordinate 3 is exactly in the middle between 1 and 5. So basically, the coordinates of any midpoint is the average of the coordinates of the points you're using. In general, if we want a general equation for midpoint, if I have 2 points P1 with coordinates x1, y1, and P2 with coordinates x2, y2, the midpoint of these 2 general coordinates is the average of those 2 values. x1 plus x2 over 2 is the average of the x coordinates. y1 plus y2 over 2 is the average of the y coordinates. So this is really just the average of x's, and this is average of the y's. Because if the midpoint is the middle value of a set of coordinates, another way of measuring middle value is mean, or average, which is why we're taking the average of those 2 coordinates. So let's apply this formula to some examples. For your reference, recall that the midpoint formula is the average of the 2 values. So if I want the midpoints of these first 2 coordinates, they will occur at the average, which is -5 plus 4 over 2 in the x coordinate, and 2 minus 2 over 2 in the y coordinate. Why minus 2? Well, when I add a negative, it's the same as subtracting. So what I end up with is -1/2, 0. Will be the midpoint for number 1. For number 2, average of the x's is 1.3 plus 2.4 over 2. The average for the y's is 2.5 plus 1.6 over 2, which leaves me with 3.7 over 2 and 4.1 over 2. If I do those divisions, I end up with 1.85 using a calculator, and 4.1 divided by 2 will give me 2.05. There's my midpoint. You could also label it M for midpoint. M for midpoint. And the last one will be 3/2 minus 1/4 over 2, and 1/2 plus 1/4 over 2. This is then equal, if I get a common denominator, to 6 fourths minus 1/4 over 2, and 2 fourths plus 1/4 over 2, which is 5 fourths over 2, and 3 fourths over 2. Now recall that when you're simplifying fractions, division when involving fractions, is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So this is really 5/4 times 1/2, and this is really 3/4 times 1/2, which gives me 5/8 and 1/4. I'm sorry, 3/8. My last midpoint. Next, if I give you the midpoint and I want the coordinates of the other value, we'll recall that the midpoint would equal the average of the other two values, so I'm going to call point B x, y, and I need to find both of those coordinates to know where point B resides. Well, the midpoint is equal to the average of the x's, which will be x plus 4 over 2 in this case, and the average of the y's, which will be 6 plus y over 2. Well, this midpoint, I know, is -3, 0. So -3 should equal x plus 4 over 2, because in order for those points to be the same, their x coordinates must be equal, which tells me that -6 equals x plus 4, or that x is -10. For the y's, 0 would equal 6 plus y over 2, which tells me that 0 equals 6 plus y, or that y is -6. So it appears that the coordinates for point B are the x value, -10, and the y value, -6. So it's basically using this formula in reverse. For number 5, again, I will use B as xy, which means that the midpoint for -8 would be equal to the average of the x's, 5 plus x over 2, and the average of the y's, y minus 3 over 2. So that 5 plus x over 2 is 4, or 5 plus x is 8, which means that x is 3. -8 would equal y minus 3 over 2, which means that -16 equals y minus 3, or that y is equal to -13. So coordinates for B are 3, -13. And the last one, again applying that midpoint formula, only slightly trickier because I have decimals, is that the midpoint, 3.2, -1.8. For the last one, again using this midpoint formula, would be that the midpoint, which is 3.2, -1.8, should equal the average of the x values and the average of the y values, which in this case would be x plus 1.4 over 2 and y minus 1.7 over 2. Which tells me that 6.4 equals x plus 1.4, so that x is 5. For y minus 1.7 would equal -3.6, which tells me that y equals -1.9. So my coordinates for point B are 5, -1.9.